Otto Baumberger was born in Alstetten, Switzerland in 1889, which was then an independent region but was later absorbed into the city of Zurich. In his early teens he attended a course at the Applied Arts School in Zurich, where he became particularly adept with the use of traditional stone lithography. In 1908, at the age of 19, he was awarded a scholarship to study at the Munich Art Academy, followed by yet more at the Académie Colarossi in Paris. His ambition at the time was to work as an artist, but when he returned to Switzerland in 1911, his background training in lithography was instrumental in securing him employment with the Wolfensberger Printing Company in Zurich, and he set about the creation of cleanly executed designs which blended modernism with more expressionist mock woodcut line styling for the company's many clients. Despite this full-time position, he also continued to work as an artist, if only as a secondary occupation. Most frequently he created monochrome lithographic and woodcut prints, also with a pronounced expressionist influence. Within a couple of years, Baumberger's aesthetic design sensibilities developed to equal his obvious command of the lithographic process, and he was creating more posters which were possessed of greater distinctive qualities. These he rendered initially in gouache paint as guides for their translation into print, and fairly unusually for the time he also took personal responsibility for their translation into separate elements for each colour run on a series of lithographic stones, a process many other designers handed over to technicians. As a unique melting pot of several European nationalities, Switzerland remained neutral during the Great War of 1914, and consequently Baumberger wasn't hampered by any wartime restrictions or reduction in his output. Nevertheless, at this time he completed his compulsory national military service, while simultaneously continuing to create posters and occasional lithographic prints, although it was clearly his commercial work which was dominant in his output by now. Baumberger was displaying enviable levels of versatility in his posters, with both impressionistic and more representational images alongside bolder, more formal graphic solutions. What was undeniable was that he could not be easily categorized, and he appears to have approached each assignment with the intention of never using the same technique twice in a row. It was also during the years of the war that his first travel posters appeared, and this would continue to be prevalent throughout his career. It was also apparent that he embraced the graphic designer's primary objective of placing the needs of the client above all other considerations, but without any obvious compromise in his own creative expression, which was a heady cocktail of any number of influences from other more rigidly defined art and design movements. And stirred together with his own inherent aesthetic impulse, he produced a body of remarkably distinctive images, the diversity of which few could hope to emulate. And such was his value to Wolfsberger by this point, the company made him artistic director of their entire operation, as a sign of their appreciation of his contribution. Despite his ongoing and increasing success as a poster designer and his supposedly full-time employment with the Wolfensberger printing house, Baumberger also explored other areas of expression. And in 1920 he created a collection of remarkably absorbing paintings of the characters and scenes in a Berlin production of Goethe's story of Faust and his pact with the devil. In this context, his style was clearly divorced from any of the approaches he'd used to date in his poster work, and although I can find no definitive information as to how they were created, they were almost certainly produced using washes of watercolour or perhaps diluted gouache. I can find no record of how well the book sold or whether it was a limited edition, which seems fairly likely, but whatever its commercial success may have been, its creative and aesthetic success was obvious. And it remains one of the most personal and imaginative visualizations of this particularly sinister dramatic classic. Only a year later, in 1921, the vision of the Knight Undulus, who I can find no clarification about other than he seems to have been Irish and lived in the 12th century, was also published. But the images Baumberger created are so dazzlingly fractured, colourful, and in places truly disturbing, that their historical or mythical significance matters little, to me at least. With their mock woodcut styling and swirling complex compositions, these illustrations are a collection of unique dark fantasies, with echoes of the nightmarish qualities of a Hieronymus Bosch painting that are impossible to forget. In the early 1920s, he created the first of what would be a series of posters for the PKZ clothing company, and even when creating advertising work for the same clients such as this, Baumberger continued to vary his graphic approach quite conspicuously, flying in the face of the generally held view that there should be a recognisable house style. That Baumberger was the very same person who had created the Faust images and the Undulus book seems an impossible stretch, but given the remarkable diversity of graphic approaches he exhibited in his posters, it perhaps should not be all that surprising. And arguably the only thing his posters had in common was that they favoured the use of single characters or objects, but even that wasn't always the case. In 1923 he also produced this medievalist and equally disturbing painting involving headless characters, but I have no idea why. Similarly, in 1924 he created this religious lithograph, but I've been unable to discover whether it was created as art or perhaps a book illustration. And in the same year he produced this harrowing two-colour image lamenting man's fondness for war in an unknown magazine. And there is also fairly abundant other evidence of his ongoing determination to continue working as an artist, with prints and actual paintings being produced throughout his lifetime. But the volume of posters he was designing by the middle of the decade was truly staggering, and the level of visual variety he applied was similarly beyond belief, and if anything was becoming even more pronounced than it had been a few years earlier. I know that I've featured several others who have demonstrated stylistic diversity in their work, but in the case of Baumberger, these posters appear to have emanated from a number of entirely different image makers, rather than just one man. The extraordinary levels of versatility to be found in his posters prompted me to attempt to find evidence that he was in fact employing others and effectively working as an art director over their output, but there's absolutely nothing to suggest that this was the case. On occasion he dispensed with illustration altogether and created some posters which were pure graphic design when it seemed appropriate. He also got married around the middle of the decade to the graphic designer and illustrator Johanna Pulfer, and she did take on responsibility for creating the typography for much of his subsequent poster output, with no apparent drop in quality or change of approach. The couple also produced a son, Rudolf, born in 1929. Baumberger's determination to deny categorization continued not only throughout the later 1920s, but remained the case into the 1930s, with an outpouring of creative commercial solutions which were ubiquitous on walls all over Switzerland, and frequently appeared with variations of the four languages spoken in the country. The range of different clients he was working for was as wide as his graphic approaches, and the evidence clearly confirms that Baumberger intuitively understood the demands of the brief, with formality and more whimsical designs produced to meet the client's needs, whether overtly mainstream commercial or more esoteric in nature. The influences Baumberger brought to bear on his posters were clear to see. German expressionism continued to be a particular favourite, perhaps because it chimed so well with lithographic reproduction. And yet there were other examples which displayed more representational, conventionally painted approaches. What would later be called Art Deco was another flatter and geometric type of image making he demonstrated considerable prowess with, and at times the formal and frequently diagonal structured minimalism of the Bauhaus was evident. Although the versatility of his approaches was undeniable, it was apparent that to an extent at least, he was becoming increasingly in demand for the production of travel posters, which actually did conform to an identical stylistic and technical execution. And for these he used what could fairly be described as his most painterly approach, with a collection of richly coloured scenic views of the frequently breathtaking landscape of his home country, with no agenda other than to tempt the viewer with their manifest beauty. In 1939, Europe was at war again thanks to Hitler's determination to expand his empire, but along with a handful of other countries, Switzerland remained neutral and therefore largely unaffected. And although it looks like it, this poster from the year the war began was not referring to the conflict, but was a somewhat ill-timed Swiss Air Force flypast in Dubendorf. He also continued to design travel posters promoting the beauties of rural Switzerland, and strangely a couple of these were printed with the text in English, and I can only suppose they were aimed at American tourists, as it seems highly unlikely any British civilian visitors would be heading anywhere in Europe in 1940. Some of Baumberger's posters from this time did refer to war-related matters, such as this emotional appeal for the International Red Cross, and this equally moving plea in Italian to help repatriated citizens. But he seems to have been more than usually occupied as an artist at this time, and created quite a few pleasing sketchy landscapes in pencil and watercolour. He also painted a couple of references to warfare at this time, but they were historical in nature, and although I'm uncertain what their purpose was, they may well have been educational. But although the end of the war didn't bring about the actual end of his career as a poster artist, and he did create at least a few more extolling the unspoilt attractions of rural Switzerland, he seems to have placed poster work firmly on the back burner and become far more interested in other avenues of expression for his illustrated work. In 1948 he published a collection of totally atypical floral watercolours of the kind his wife had made a reputation with, which may possibly have been to illustrate a book on the subject, but equally they could well have been created with no other purpose than to be sold as decorative lithographs for domestic hanging. In 1950 he did produce this poster for an exhibition of his work, but otherwise he threw himself wholesale into the illustration of books, alongside the creation of more prints and paintings for exhibition and sale to collectors. In 1955 he published an illustrated edition of The Legend of William Tell, for which he created numerous suitably rousing sepia-coloured line and wash monochromes depicting several crucial moments from the story. And for good measure he added a smaller number of even more impressive full-colour images which concentrated more on the vast forbidding beauty of the Swiss Alps. He followed this in 1957 with a collection titled Biblical Drawings. I found no evidence of any accompanying text, but each illustration did quote the biblical location of the relevant verse. So it may well be that rather than being created to illuminate written content, they may have been collected more as a portfolio of lithographic drawings. Whatever the case, all the images he created made for a particularly striking and emotionally charged body of work, which completely sidestepped the more sentimental approach to the subject taken by countless others. The last and only example of a poster I could find was this for a Swiss political party, using the image of a well-known early Swiss educator, Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi, in 1959. And Otto Baumberger died 2 years later in 1961 at the age of 72 in Bruderberg, Winningen. Das Märchenbuch, a collection of fairy tales by the brothers Grimm and their less well-known contemporary Ludwig Bechstein, with colour illustrations by Baumberger, was, according to every source I could track down, first published in 1965, 4 years after his death, and they appear to have been created with what looks very much like coloured pencil or maybe oil pastels. And I'm not convinced about the supposedly posthumous publication of these images, but I can find nothing to support my suspicion that it was just a reprint from an unknown earlier publication. And the same is also true of a 1967 publication of a version of the medieval legend of Till Eulenspiegel, written by Charles de Coster in the later 19th century. In this instance the book featured sketchy graphite or perhaps lithographic monochrome illustrations by Baumberger. Why these had not been published in his lifetime, if it's true that they hadn't, nobody wants to tell me, so I can't tell you. Otherwise all I can do is finish this embarrassingly uninformative but hopefully enjoyable tribute to the genius of Otto Baumberger, with yet more of his astonishing and incredibly diverse images from his long and productive career.